Welcome to Faith Connections. Today we continue our journey in the Christmas story, and we find ourselves in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And we meet some very familiar people, the wise men. They show up every Christmas. They make their appearance in the children's Christmas program and in our favorite Christmas carols. I wonder if it might be they have become so familiar to us that we have forgotten or lost sight of their significance in this story. I mean, who are these mysterious magi? Where do they come from? And why were they inclined to follow a star? Well, they could have been wise men or priests or astrologers or magicians or even kings, some have suggested. We really just don't know. But there's one thing for certain. It's almost as if they were watching for the appearance of the star. It was as if they were expecting it to appear. Now, this event was striking to the point that it got the attention of these wise men, the magi, and they recognized it as a unique sign from heaven. In fact, verse 2 clearly explains that the magi interpreted this divine sign as something that would lead them to the Messiah, the King of the Jews. And so when Jesus was still a toddler, about 2 years old, the magi from the east came to visit him and his family. They traveled many miles from a land that was their home to a land that was not, to worship somebody they did not know. And yet they knew they needed to go to discover the newborn King of the Jews. Now, when it comes to these wise men, we truthfully don't know how many they were. We've kind of always assumed there were three, and we've done that because there are three gifts mentioned: gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Well, history would tell us that there were probably more than three of them. They would have traveled in a greater number, if for nothing else but safety. But we also don't know really where they came from. Many, I think, would believe from Babylon. But like I said earlier, we know they traveled a great distance to a land that was not their own, and they traveled with little information, and they didn't know what they would exactly find in Jerusalem. But they did know they were going to see, or hopefully to see, the King of the Jews. And when you think about that, well, that's a remarkable step of faith, isn't it? I mean, to leave a place you know to a place you don't know with little information, that's a pretty good definition of faith. Well, here's their story. It's Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea during the time of King Herod, magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one to be born King of the Jews? That has been born King of the Jews. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all of Jerusalem with him. When he had called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." Then Herod called the magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me so that I too may go and worship him." After they had heard the king, they went on their way, and the star they had seen when it rose, went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child and his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshiped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. Now, if we were to fast forward for just a second our story to verse 16 in chapter 2, we would see that it implies what we mentioned earlier, that the Magi appear in Jerusalem some 2 years after Jesus has been born. Because we know that Herod is threatened by his birth. And so as a result of that, and what he receives from the Magi, the information that he receives from the Magi, he has the babies in Jerusalem and the surrounding areas, 2 years of age and younger, put to death. Now, these wise men came to Jerusalem because the star pointed them in that direction to the center of Jewish religion and politics. And their purpose was to come and worship him. The idea of worship here is about laying face down or lying face down. It's a matter of respect and submission and reverence. Now, whether the Magi considered this child divine or just merely a human heir to the throne of Israel, we know that their quest, whatever it was disturbing to the sitting king, Herod the Great. He ruled in that position from about 37 BC to 4 BC. So it doesn't matter whether they saw him as divine or human. Herod saw the birth of Jesus and this whole story as a threat to his kingdom. So as foreigners, the Magi went to the capital of Israel to learn the exact location of the child. The star would have convinced them that a royal birth had taken place in the West. And they were in search of this new king. Now, ancient people would have strongly believed that there was a connection between the birth of a new star and the birth of a new or prominent king. This is probably why the Magi sought out Herod. It would have just made sense to them that such a baby would have most likely been born in his household. So what does it say that, again, these Magi acted with so little information to go on, but still chose to make a trip to worship Jesus? It goes back to this matter of faith. We see this disparity in the response of people. I mean, there's clear indication that the people of the East would not have believed in this idea of a Messiah. And yet here's Herod, who they've come to worship. But Herod, he's afraid and agitated. He's intimidated. He'd kind of ruled his world through intimidation and violence. It's kind of it was peace, but an uneven, an uneasy peace. And this news was likely upset the apple cart. Now, Herod was an Edomite. And so our story said he didn't likely know scripture very well and would have had to kind of gather his information as quickly as possible so he would know how to take the next step. What we find interesting in Herod and the Jewish leaders' reaction is that they're not surprised that the Messiah has been born, because their prophets had foretold this event. Yet it's the foreigners who saw the signs first and brought the news to them. It's kind of backwards of what you might think. But we continue to see in that story that we read that Herod did what leaders seem instinctively to do. When there's a question, he calls a meeting. And so he assembles the leaders of Jerusalem, the Sadducees and the Pharisees and the chief priests and other influential leaders, and wants to know where the Messiah is born. In essence, they refer back to a passage in Micah that just says that he would be born in Bethlehem, the birthplace of David, or the hometown of David, Israel's greatest king. Now, when Herod has a moment, private audience with the Magi, he asks again about when the star had first appeared. And so he starts putting two and two together so that he can orchestrate his plan to how to do battle and eliminate his potential rival to the throne. Herod was quite a character. First century Jewish historian by the name of Josephus documents Herod's paranoia. And he had his second wife and three sons and other relatives and untold enemies executed when he suspected that they were putting a plot together to take over the throne. So if you're that kind of ruthless leader, I would imagine not a problem for him to issue the order that all infants under the age of 2 be put to death. Herod wanted to protect his throne at all costs. Herod tells these wise men, the Magi, nothing of his plan. He just continues with his character. He only informed them that his advisors had said that the birthplace would be Bethlehem. But before he sends them to Bethlehem, he says, when you find out, carefully search for the child, but when you find him, come back and let me know, because I'd like to worship him too. Well, true to his form and his dishonesty, he claimed to want to worship the child, but the truth is, he wanted to know how he could eliminate his threat. These Magi, these wise men, see through his plot and they return to their homeland through a different route. But I think what's most striking about this story is this idea of worship, this people who should have, especially, I guess the religious leaders should have seen that he was the Messiah, but they were restless. And then these men from the east came, and they came to worship. When the Magi saw the star, they were overjoyed. And when they came to the home where Jesus was, here's what I find powerful. They bowed down and worshiped him and presented gifts to him. Now, the gifts were impractical gifts for an infant, for a child. I mean, gold, frankincense, and myrrh, but they were expensive gifts, and they were perfect gifts for a king. A king who, it says, would shepherd his people. He would become the shepherd king. But again, here's what's most powerful about our story is this idea of worship. The Magi found that the star had led them to a place where Christ was, and their response was to worship. They help us discover a pattern for our own act of worship, meaningful worship. They entered with joyful hearts. How that might change if we arrive at our time of worship with hearts that were joyful. They sought after Christ diligently. they were in search of him. They humbled themselves and demonstrated great respect. They worshiped reverently. They bowed down. They gave generously in their gifts that were very expensive, and they obeyed fully. They were people of faith. So these people who show up at our Christmas programs every year and are a part of our favorite Christmas carols have much to teach us. And this Christmas season, on this Sunday after Christmas, I wonder if we might need to pay a little extra attention to how we worship. May this Christmas season remind us of what it really means to worship the King. Those who should have known seem to have missed it. May we not miss who Jesus is this season.